Do you struggle with trying to understand God's plan for your life? Have you ever wondered, what in the world is God doing with my life? Or maybe you once believed God had a particular plan for your life, but based off your current circumstances, you're struggling to see the beauty in His plan. Well, be encouraged, because you're not alone. In today's episode, I'm going to tell you about a man who experienced those very feelings and the amazing way that God showed up in his life, as well as my own experiences, trying to understand and trust in God's plan for my life. So stay tuned, because I want to encourage you to keep believing God's plan for you. Hello, extraordinary child of God. If you are looking to transition your life from where you are to where God wants you to be, then you, my friend, are in the right place. If this is your first time visiting my channel, come on and join our community by hitting that subscribe button as well as the notification bell so that you won't miss another episode. Now let me ask you, do you like my new Extraordinary Through Christ t-shirt? I hope you do, because I think you should get yourself one. Let the world and the devil know who you are in Christ. You can visit my website, SaMonna to order, or you can click the link in the description below. Now, there was a boy who had big dreams. He believed that God was going to do something special in his life. And like many children his age, he believed he'd be somebody great when he grew up. Now remember, he was just a child, and the dreams of children generally are untainted with things like doubt, fears, and the I can't syndrome that many of us as adults struggle with. So there was no reason in his mind to think that God hadn't created him to accomplish great things. But you know how it goes when you begin to share your thoughts and dreams with others who suffer from impaired vision? You know what I'm talking about? You're all excited about the path you believe God is going to take you down, but instead of receiving joy and support from others, you receive nothing but hate, along with all the reasons they believe your dream is too lofty. And this happens because their limited vision tells them certain things aren't possible. And this is exactly what happened to this young boy. But God had a plan for his life, and thankfully God's plan was not dependent upon the opinion of others, nor was it dependent upon this boy's circumstances. You see, as this boy grew older, he experienced some horrible things that would send even the strongest of human beings into a deep depression and completely shatter their dreams. Because this boy experienced the sting of being hated by those who were supposed to love him, the sting of being treated like a slave, despite the fact that the blood that ran through his veins was destined to be royal. He also experienced a sting of loneliness, rejection, and the deepest betrayal. This boy's life had taken a terrible turn for the worse, and the plans God had for his life seemed to be shattered. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Joseph, then you have an idea of what I'm talking about. The final chapters in the book of Genesis reveal the story of a man whose dreams seemed to be shattering right before his very eyes because he was betrayed by people who were close to him. Now, oftentimes we read stories in the Bible and we look at them as just that, stories. But the fact is, these are not just stories. These are accounts of real people who experienced some real stuff. Now, can you imagine for one moment how Joseph must have felt when God revealed to him that one day he would be a great ruler? Now imagine the disappointment and hurt he must have felt when he shared this revelation with his family, and instead of encouraging him, they trampled all over his dream with their hate. Imagine how it must have felt for Joseph to live in a household where he was hated by his own brothers. Can you imagine? And if, knowing what I know about Joseph's story, if I could just go back in time, I would just whisper in his ear, keep believing God's plan for you. Now I want you to put yourself in Joseph's shoes. When he went to check on his brothers, and instead of being greeted by the friendly smiles of family, he was greeted by the angry glares of irrational men. Imagine how it must have felt when they took him and tossed him into a cold, dark, and scary pit. Imagine how Joseph must have felt when his body slammed up against that hard, cold ground, and imagine how he must have felt when they took him out of that pit, not to free him, but to sell him into slavery. Imagine how the tears must have rolled down his face uncontrollably as he was taken away from his home forever. And if I could go back into time, I would just hug Joseph and let his tears fall on my shoulders as I whispered into his ear, "Keep believing God's plan for you." Then after things settled down a bit and Joseph finds himself in a new normal, things aren't great, but they aren't as horrible as they could be because Joseph's character has outshone his circumstances. He's a servant, but he's a highly respected servant in the house of Potiphar. Now, can you then imagine the fear that must have gripped his body when he realized that Potiphar's wife was accusing him of one of the most heinous crimes? And can you imagine how his body must have trembled when he found himself being accused and convicted of attempted rape? Can you imagine how easy it must have been for him to just give up and throw in the towel on this thing called life? And if I could just go back to the day when he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, I would whisper in his ear, "Keep believing God's plan for you." Then there were the years he spent in prison. Can you imagine the thoughts that must have went through his head and how he must have wondered, what had he done to deserve such a horrible life? Can you imagine how his heart ached for his father, or how he must have wished that he could have just one true friend? And can you just imagine the deep depression he must have been in based off of his circumstances? And if I could go back in time, I would simply whisper in his ear, "Keep believing God's plan for you." It's hard to believe God's plan for you when everything that's going on in your life seems to be working against you. That's tough. It's hard to get past the pain of uncertainty, of tragedy, of loneliness, fear, and the cruelty of others. It's hard to believe that God has a special plan for you when your life seems to be heading in the opposite direction of anything special or worthwhile. But regardless of what your circumstances are, you've got to believe and know that God has a beautiful and a wonderful plan for your life. And the reason Joseph's story is so amazing is because it gives us a glimpse into the journey many of us will have to take to finally reach and experience the wonderful plan that God has for us. Joseph suffered so much, and his pain was great. But the reason his suffering was so severe is because the plan that God had for him was oh so great that he had to make sure that Joseph was prepared for it. You see, the enemy recognized that God was going to do some amazing things in Joseph's life, so he worked overtime trying to destroy Joseph's spirit. But what he failed to realize is that every hurtful thing he caused Joseph to experience, God was using to build his character. So that finally on that day, when it was time for that little boy's dreams of one day becoming a great ruler to finally come true, Joseph was ready. His character had been formed and strengthened in the fire, and he was now ready to be that great ruler he had dreamed of. Now, just imagine how Joseph must have felt on that day when they pulled him out of prison, cleaned him up, presented him before Pharaoh, and then after his presentation, Pharaoh looks at him and declares that he's no longer a prisoner, but he is now the great governor of Egypt. After all those long years of hurt and pain, God had lifted him up to a great position. And this is exactly why you have to keep believing God's plan for you. In life, you're going to experience setbacks and pain, but never lose your hold on God. You see, we often think that God's plans for us should happen right away. We are impatient, but God's not impatient. Understand that Joseph knew what he was destined to be when he was just a child, but it wasn't until he was 30 years old that God's plan for his life became a reality. In other words, Joseph had to wait for years, but during the wait, God was steadily leading him and guiding him. I understand that the wait can be tough and it can be confusing. I've been there myself. There have been so many times when I doubted and went back and forth in my own mind about what God's plans were for my life. When the fact is, I knew for a certainty that God had told me way back at the end of 2013 that he wanted me to speak for him. So after Braden died, I knew that God wanted me to do ministry. That wasn't really a question in my mind. But after all that I had just been through, I was praying, hoping, assuming that this ministry thing would come easy. And while God let me know that he was going to take me places in ministry, he also let me know that in the process, he was going to have to allow me to experience more pain. Pain that was very hurtful to me because it came from people who were close to me, right in the middle of the fact that I was dealing with the loss of my son. And I give all praise to God. I give praise to God for helping me get through that, and in the process showing me that he was strengthening me and building my character. Because in ministry, you have to have tough skin so that you can withstand all of the attacks the enemy is going to send your way. So I have a little understanding, just a little bit, of how Joseph must have felt when his brothers turned on him. And then there were the other things, like the finances, the money. Because honestly, I couldn't figure out how speaking for God would supply my needs. And then I was bombarded with the thoughts of others who believed that because I was a lawyer, I should be practicing law. I mean, that makes sense, right? Well, people are going to have opinions about God's plans for your life. But the fact is, when God took the time to create you in your mother's womb and determine the plans that he had for your life, he didn't take counsel with those people who are so quick to make determinations about you and God's plans for you. He didn't do it because he's God and they aren't. So along my journey, I couldn't see clearly how God was going to work out his plans in my life, and my path took turns that seemed to be going far away from his plan, not towards it. Because there was a season where I did go back to practice law. But every day I was at work, I could not stop thinking about God's plans for my life. And what I've come to understand is that even when the path to God's plans for your life seem to be redirected or even derailed, that does not mean that God's plans for you have changed. Which is why you have to keep believing God's plan for you. And I can tell you right now, for me, I am on a faith journey. Yes, I am operating in the plans God has for me, but for some reason, I believe I'm only scratching the surface. So in this year, 2020, I said, I'm tired of tiptoeing around this thing. I'm ready to experience all that God has for me. I'm done with trying to do ministry part-time while I try to balance working full-time or even part-time at another job. I'm ready by faith to jump fully into what God has for me, understanding that the journey to get there very well may come with many challenges. But that's okay, because if Joseph could go through what he went through, surely I can make it through, and you can too. So keep believing God's plan for you. He loves you, he cares about you, and he wants the absolute best for you. So don't get discouraged along the journey, no matter how challenging it may be. Don't let other people who can't see the amazing things God has planned for you discourage you. And definitely don't allow life circumstances to cause you to believe God has forsaken you. Just keep your eyes on Jesus and remember how he worked things out so perfectly for Joseph after Joseph had suffered so very long. Now, if you aren't really familiar with the amazing story of the life of Joseph, I want you to go to the book of Genesis and start with chapter 37 and just start reading from there to the end of the book, and you'll get a great synopsis of the life of Joseph. Now, if you're committed to keep believing God's plan for you, comment below and simply say, I believe. And please feel free to leave any other thoughts you might have. We are a community and we are here to support each other. So leave your comments below. I love you. God has a plan for you, and you are extraordinary through Christ. See you next week, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe. God bless.